Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we are deeply involved in our study of the Olivet Discourse, and we've been focusing on Matthew chapter 25, 31, and following. Now, let me very, very quickly lay the groundwork and the foundation for why I'm doing some of what I'm doing right now. I've been sharing with you several passages that are absolutely directly parallel with Matthew 25, 31 and following, demonstrating that in these other parallel passages, we have temporal markers that delimit the fulfillment of the events of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following to the first century. And that means that no matter what our concepts might be as to the nature of the fulfillment, we have very graphic, very explicit, and very specific time indicators of when it was to be fulfilled. Now, what that means is that futurists are in a box. And the way they respond to that is, well, time doesn't mean anything to God. God doesn't talk in time like man does. And by the way, folks, that's foolishness. Absolute foolishness. And I'm not trying to be harsh, not trying to be critical, okay? I'm simply pointing out that from a biblical perspective, that is absolutely false. Now, one of the things that I've been doing is showing the comparison between Daniel 12, Matthew 25, 31 and following, and Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 11. Now we're headed back to Revelation as we continue this discourse, but what I've been wanting to do is to demonstrate that Daniel chapter 12 is in fact the foundation. It lies behind Matthew 25, 31 and following. If therefore, and I would say more accurately, since therefore, Daniel chapter 12 contains numerous chronological parameters as to the time of the fulfillment of these events, then that means, okay, Daniel 12 equals Matthew 25, 31 and following. Matthew 25, 31 and following equals Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 delimits the time of the fulfillment of the events that he foretold to the time when the power of the holy people will be completely shattered. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. Therefore, Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, being equal to Daniel chapter 12, would be fulfilled no later than the time when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. I'm sorry, folks, that's just real simple logic. So in order to destroy that argument, you have to be able to demonstrate that Daniel chapter 12 is not the parallel with Matthew 25, 31 and following. So what happens? Well, what happens is we have men such as Kyle Pope in his book, Thinking About AD 70, which I've reviewed, and which, by the way, in a week or so, I'll be looking at the video that he produced to try to answer my videos. But nonetheless, when he comes to Daniel chapter 12, you've really honestly never seen such a job of hop, skip, and jump. He's literally all over the map. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, end of time. And then from there, he goes down through Daniel chapter 12. Oh, well, this is Antiochus Epiphanes. Oh, well, this is back to the end of time. It makes the narrative flow of the text such a hodgepodge of hop, skip, and jump, and it makes you wonder, and we have every right in the world to ask. And by the way, Mr. Pope is not the only one who takes this position. Former preterists such as Sam Frost do the same identical thing with the text of Daniel chapter 12. Oh, Antiochus, end of time. Antiochus, end of time. Antiochus, end of time. What? So I ask the question, where would you ever get from the text of Daniel chapter 12 that from verse to verse, inspiration is jumping back and forth 2,200 years? Boom, 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 boom. Where would you get that idea? From the text. And the fact is, you would never get it from the text. And the second point is, you literally have to explain away the language of Daniel chapter 12 in order to maintain that position. I mean, you literally have to explain it away and say, well, it doesn't mean what it says. Okay, so in yesterday's video, I pointed out to you, we began to discuss all of these temporal markers in Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 is one of them in its prediction of the Great Tribulation. I demonstrated to you how there are efforts being made to say Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 applied to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Historically, that simply is untenable. It will not work. Please go back and watch that video from yesterday. So, secondly, notice now, at that time there shall be great tribulation. Now verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust shall arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. Now, once again, this is where the dichotomy, the dividing, the slicing and dicing takes place. This is where Mr. Pope says, verse 2 is the end of time, verse 1, Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, here's the problem with that. Notice that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 closes with the promise, and at that time your people shall be delivered. Well, guess what? Israel was not delivered in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Oh, they had a brief respite of 3.5 years or so under the Maccabees, but it was not their deliverance. And somebody says, well, the Jews were completely destroyed in AD 70. Well, yeah, but guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Jesus emphatically tells us that in the destruction of Jerusalem, that would be when Israel's redemption, which is the redemption of the righteous remnant, would take place. Luke chapter 21 and verse 28. But I must move on. My point being this, that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 talks about the deliverance of Daniel's people, and the very next verse is talking about how, or the result of that, if you please, and that's the resurrection. How do you divorce the deliverance of Daniel's people from the time of the resurrection? Now, I've stated before, and I want to say this again. The only way that you can go to Daniel chapter 12 and get this dichotomized view of eschatology out of it is you have to ignore the narrative reading, the narrative flow of the text, and create this hodgepodge, this hop, skip, and jump theology, as if the ancient readers would understand that. And, you know, they're supposed to understand it. After all, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel prophet, then let those who read understand. So Jesus told his first century apostles that when they would see the events of the first century, they're supposed to understand Daniel. Which raises the question, if Daniel was not actually predicting the events that the apostles were to see, then how were they supposed to understand Daniel? Because Daniel, his prophecy, according to that paradigm, literally has nothing to do with the events of the first century. It's all about the 2nd century BC, fulfilled at that time, and not predictive of the first century. So how would they understand Daniel by seeing the events that were to transpire in their place or in their time if Daniel didn't predict events of their time? But I must go on. There's something here, ladies and gentlemen, that is absolutely critical. Now, let me reiterate what is going on in the theological world in order to avoid the force of Daniel chapter 12. Verse 1, Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 2, the end of time. Now, what that does, ladies and gentlemen, and I only have a very brief time to lay this out for you this morning. I'll pick it up tomorrow, and I'll absolutely document this. So let me just introduce to you this morning this fact. By the way, this fact is documented by scholars such as Brent Petrie in his book, Jesus, the Tribulation and the End of Exile. It is found in the writings of N.T. Wright. It is found in the writings of Richard Hayes. It is found in the writings of Scott McKnight and other scholars. So this is not something contrived and invented by preterists. This is a well understood doctrine. Emil Schurer, in his 4-volume set on Jerusalem in the times of Jesus the Messiah, says there was a well-attested, well-understood doctrine in Judaism that before the kingdom, before the coming of the Lord, before the judgment, and before the resurrection, there would come a time of unparalleled tribulation. We call it the Great Tribulation. Now here's the point. Throughout the Old Testament and the New, the Great Tribulation, the time of judgment on Israel, is invariably posited as occurring immediately before the resurrection. Well, what does that mean for Daniel chapter 12? Okay, if we have this consistent narrative in passage after passage after passage of the Great Tribulation followed by resurrection, then to destroy that narrative in Daniel chapter 12, you have to be able to say, okay, in Isaiah 26, you have tribulation followed by resurrection. In Hosea chapter 13, you have tribulation followed by resurrection. In Micah chapter 4, you have tribulation followed by resurrection. That's all true, but even though in Daniel chapter 12, we have tribulation followed by resurrection, Daniel chapter 12 is talking about something totally different. It's talking about one event that happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, 174 to 164 BC, and verse 2 is the end of time. So we have this consistent narrative over here, and ostensibly we have the same narrative in Daniel chapter 12, but Daniel chapter 12 is totally, radically different. Now, is that, sort of kind of theologically, potentially true? Maybe, but you have to prove it. And you can't. Now, as an introduction to what I'm going to share with you tomorrow, let me urge you that you go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and you order my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future. I have an entire chapter, ladies and gentlemen, with an extended discussion, documentation, both from scholarship, Jewish rabbis, as well as the Bible, most importantly of all, of the fact that biblically you have tribulation followed immediately by resurrection. And that is so incredibly significant when we come to the Olivet Discourse. But I have more to say about that. On the flip side, order the book. You'll be glad you did. I'll see you on the flip side.